In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled behind white fences and neatly trimmed lawns, lived Margaret, a widow who found her only comfort in a small garden of flowers. Each bloom was planted in memory of her late husband. But to the homeowners association, the garden wasn't a memorial, it was a violation. They claimed it disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. Margaret had received the first letter months ago. A warning, cold and impersonal, demanding she uproot the very flowers that kept her husband's memory alive. Neighbors whispered. Some pitied her. Others sided with the HOA, afraid of fines or losing favor. But Margaret, she refused to back down. One evening, as she watered the roses, a board member stormed onto her lawn, shouting about rules and compliance. Margaret's voice trembled, but her words were steady. These flowers are all I have left of him. They're not weeds, they're memories. The man scoffed, muttering about bylaws, and left. But that night, something strange happened. Margaret woke to see her entire garden shimmering under the moonlight. Each flower pulsed with a glow, brighter, stronger, as if alive. Word spread quickly. Neighbors gathered, staring in disbelief at the widow's garden that bloomed brighter than ever, at midnight. But the HOA wasn't impressed. To them, the glow was irrelevant, rules were rules, and the garden had to go. They issued a second letter, this time with a fine attached. Margaret was told she had 14 days before legal action. She stood alone, clutching the paper, but the garden seemed to glow brighter that night, as if defying the HOA itself. Some neighbors began to side with her. They whispered that maybe the garden was more than flowers, maybe it was a miracle. But the HOA tightened their grip. They scheduled an emergency meeting, one that would decide the fate of Margaret's garden once and for all. As Margaret prepared for the meeting, she whispered to her husband's memory, "If these flowers must fall, let them shine brighter tonight than ever before." The night before the meeting, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by letters, fines, and memories. The garden's glow flickered through the window, as if it refused to let her give up. At midnight, she stepped outside, barefoot in the cool grass, and whispered, "Stay with me tonight." The flowers seemed to pulse in reply. The next morning, the HOA clubhouse buzzed with activity. Men and women clutched binders, quoting bylaws, ready to make an example of Margaret. They called it disorderly landscaping. They called it a violation of harmony. But to Margaret, it was simply her heart, rooted in soil. That evening, she received word, the HOA demanded her presence at the emergency meeting. Tomorrow, her fate would be decided. Margaret prayed silently. Not for victory, but for strength. She feared the HOA's power, but she trusted her garden's quiet resilience. At midnight once more, the flowers bloomed even brighter. Neighbors whispered that they had never seen such light, as if the garden itself was preparing for battle. One child tugged at his mother's sleeve and said, "Mom, the flowers are protecting her." And in that moment, even the skeptics wondered. The HOA, however, dismissed it all as nonsense. To them, beauty and miracles had no place where bylaws ruled. When the night ended, Margaret stood in her garden one last time before the meeting. She whispered, "If I fall tomorrow, bloom for me tonight." Her neighbors watched from windows, conflicted between silence and support. Some began to scribble notes, planning to speak at the meeting. Margaret didn't know it yet, but she was no longer standing alone. The garden's light was quietly rallying the neighborhood. The HOA feared this. They didn't just see flowers anymore, they saw defiance. And so, the HOA drafted one final motion: not only would the garden be destroyed, but Margaret herself would face escalating fines until she surrendered. But Margaret was ready. The garden had become more than memory. It was resistance. And she would face them tomorrow, not as a widow, but as a guardian of light. The morning of the meeting arrived. Margaret dressed simply, clutching her late husband's wedding ring on a chain around her neck for strength. She walked down the street toward the HOA clubhouse. Some neighbors watched silently from porches, others nodded in quiet solidarity. Inside the clubhouse, the board members sat like judges behind a long table, papers stacked high, eyes sharp with disapproval. Margaret stepped into the room. Her footsteps echoed. Every eye turned toward her, some filled with pity, others with cold disdain. The president of the HOA cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitfield, you are in violation of multiple bylaws. Today, this board will decide your penalty." Margaret's hands trembled, but she raised her chin. "This garden is not disorderly. It is my husband's memory." Murmurs filled the room. Some neighbors who had come to watch shifted in their seats, glancing at one another with unease. The treasurer spoke up harshly, "Rules are rules. If we allow you, Mrs. Whitfield, then we must allow everyone. And that would be chaos." Margaret's voice cracked, but she refused to lower it. "Chaos? These flowers bring peace. They bring life. They bring memory." The HOA president leaned back in his chair. "You will comply, Mrs. Whitfield. Or you will face daily fines until compliance is achieved." Margaret clutched her necklace tighter. "If you fine me every day, then fine me. But I will not kill my husband's memory." Gasps echoed. Some neighbors stood in silent support. For the first time, Margaret's resistance felt larger than herself. But the board was unmoved. The secretary scribbled notes, preparing the paperwork to escalate enforcement. The president finally declared, "This board votes unanimously. The garden must be removed within 7 days, or enforcement action begins." Margaret left the meeting slowly, each step heavy. But outside, the neighbors gathered. And when she returned home, her garden glowed brighter than ever before. Margaret returned home, exhausted. But as soon as she stepped onto her porch, the garden shimmered as if sensing her despair, glowing stronger, radiant, almost alive. Neighbors watched in awe. Some whispered about miracles. Others nervously took out their phones, capturing the light and whispering to friends. That night, Margaret watered her flowers, whispering memories of her husband. And the garden seemed to respond, petals glimmering, leaves swaying as if in gentle applause. Word began spreading. Soon, a few brave neighbors approached, leaving small gifts, seeds, watering cans, notes of encouragement. The HOA, however, was relentless. They sent another notice, this time, threatening legal action if Margaret's garden wasn't destroyed by week's end. Margaret sat quietly on her porch, clutching the letter, her eyes on the glowing blooms. She whispered, "If they come for us, we will shine brighter than ever." Meanwhile, a few of the braver neighbors had decided to confront the HOA themselves. They began attending board meetings, questioning fines, and citing fairness. The HOA board noticed. Unease began to creep into their meetings. Rules and authority felt fragile. That night, as midnight approached, the garden's glow intensified. It wasn't just light, it was movement. The flowers seemed almost alive, petals twisting and stretching toward the sky. Margaret watched in awe. "They know we must protect this place," she whispered. And somehow, it felt as if the garden agreed. A few curious children crept closer, drawn by the glow. They laughed softly, stepping among the flowers without fear, as if welcomed. Word of the magical garden spread through whispers in the neighborhood. The legend of the midnight bloom began. The HOA became frantic. Authority alone was no longer enough. They planned a visit at night, hoping to catch Margaret unprepared. Margaret sensed it. The garden pulsed, brighter than ever, as if warning her of the approaching threat. And when the HOA members arrived at the edge of her property, they froze. The flowers' light spilled across the street, illuminating their stern faces in an almost supernatural glow. The HOA members stepped cautiously onto Margaret's lawn, clipboards raised like shields. The flowers pulsed brighter, as if sensing the intruders. Margaret watched from her porch, heart pounding. Stay back, she whispered, but the garden seemed to answer on its own. The first HOA member reached for a flower, and recoiled. The petals wrapped around themselves, bright light flaring as if protecting the garden. One member muttered, "It's just light, it's harmless," but as he stepped closer, the glow intensified, almost blinding. Margaret's neighbors peeked from behind fences, holding their breath. Some hid, some watched in awe, realizing the garden was no ordinary patch of flowers. The HOA president shouted orders, "Remove the flowers now." But even his voice seemed swallowed by the luminous garden. Margaret stepped onto the lawn. "If you touch them, you will regret it." Her voice was calm, but the glow around her seemed to answer with a pulse. The first HOA member tried to grab a flower again, and this time, petals shot upward, surrounding him with a blinding glow. He stumbled back, shielding his eyes. Margaret's heart raced. She realized the garden wasn't just glowing, it was defending itself, protecting her. Neighbors gasped. Some whispered, "It's alive, it's alive." Fear and awe mixed in the chilly night air. The HOA president, white-faced, barked another command. "I don't care if it glows. Pick them up." But the petals recoiled violently, scattering dust like light. Margaret felt a strange surge of strength. She raised her hands slowly, and the garden seemed to obey, light flowing outward in waves toward the HOA members. One by one, the HOA members stumbled backward, shielding themselves from the radiant light. It wasn't just glow, it was defiance, almost tangible. Margaret whispered softly to her husband's memory, and for the first time, she smiled. "We're stronger than they imagined." The HOA finally retreated to the street edge, shaken, their authority challenged by something they couldn't control, a widow and her glowing garden. Word of the glowing garden spread quickly. Neighbors who once feared the HOA now whispered of miracles and resilience. By midnight, more families gathered outside Margaret's house, drawn by the glow, their whispers turning into murmurs of encouragement. The HOA president peered from his car, unease written across his face. Authority alone was failing him. The flowers had become something larger, something unstoppable. Margaret stepped into the street, addressing the neighbors. "These flowers are more than plants. They are memory, love, and life. Tonight, we stand together." The first brave neighbor stepped forward, placing a hand gently on a glowing flower. The petals pulsed brighter, acknowledging their support. One by one, more neighbors approached, each touch making the garden bloom even brighter, turning fear into courage. The HOA members, watching from the street edge, grew frantic. "Stop this. It's only plants," one shouted, voice shaking with fear. Margaret smiled faintly. "No, it's memory, courage, and community. And we will not be broken." The garden responded as if alive. Petals lifted gently, swirling around the neighbors, creating a protective, luminous barrier. Even the skeptics among the neighbors felt it, the garden's power, a quiet force that demanded respect. The HOA president shouted again, voice breaking. "I will not be humiliated by flowers." But the light only grew stronger, washing over him like a tide. Margaret raised her hands once more, and the garden responded with a luminous pulse, brighter than the moon above, as if claiming the night as its own. The HOA members stumbled back, shielding their eyes. Authority, rules, and fines seemed meaningless against this glowing, living force. Neighbors cheered softly, inspired by Margaret's courage and the garden's luminous defiance. A sense of unity washed over the street. Margaret looked around, tears in her eyes. The garden wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And tonight, for the first time, she felt truly invincible. By dawn, rumors had spread across the neighborhood. Margaret's garden was no longer just beautiful, it was untouchable, glowing brighter each night. The HOA regrouped in their office, frustration boiling. "This is madness," one member shouted. "It's just a garden." The president slammed his fist on the table. We need action tonight. No one can defy the rules, not even glowing flowers. Margaret, meanwhile, prepared her garden for the coming night. She whispered to every flower, telling them to bloom bravely, to shine for memory and love. Neighbors arrived again, armed not with tools but with solidarity. They brought lanterns, blankets, and notes of support, forming a protective circle around the garden. At midnight, the HOA returned, determined. They brought equipment, pruning shears, shovels, and clipboards, ready to enforce their rules. The moment they stepped onto the lawn, the garden erupted with light. Petals lifted into the air, forming a dazzling barrier between Margaret and the intruders. Margaret raised her hands, feeling the pulse of the garden flow through her. "You will not harm us," she whispered, voice steady and commanding. One by one, the HOA members stumbled backward, overwhelmed by the brilliance. Authority alone could not penetrate this luminous defense. Neighbors gasped and whispered in awe. Children laughed softly, stepping forward to feel the glow, now fully trusting in the garden's power. The HOA president, furious, tried to rally his members. "Enough. Take them down, now." But the light only surged in response, almost defiant. Margaret felt a wave of calm. This was no longer about rules. It was about memory, love, and the unity of those who refused to give in. The first HOA member, trembling, whispered, We can't fight this." Others nodded, shielding eyes from the overwhelming glow. Margaret looked out at her neighbors, now fully united. "We stand together," she said. And for the first time, she felt the weight of fear lifting. The HOA, finally beaten not by words but by something far greater, retreated. Their authority had been challenged, and the garden had won. As midnight approached, Margaret walked among the flowers. Each petal shimmered, reflecting her determination. Tonight, the garden would shine like never before. Neighbors gathered, forming a protective ring. Lanterns lit the way, their faces filled with quiet courage, inspired by Margaret's resilience. The HOA, desperate, returned with stronger measures. Authorities were called, tools in hand, hoping to finally enforce the rules. Margaret raised her hands once more. The garden responded instantly, petals shooting upward, forming a luminous dome that enveloped the front yard. Even the skeptical neighbors gasped. The flowers' glow wasn't just light anymore, it was alive, protective, and commanding respect. The HOA president, pale and shaking, barked orders, but his voice was drowned by the brilliance. Authority faltered against magic and unity combined. Margaret whispered softly, feeling her husband's presence. "For love, for memory, we are unbreakable." The garden surged brighter in response. The garden pulsed like a heartbeat. Every petal seemed to radiate emotion, love, courage, and defiance, a living tribute to those who cherished it. HOA members stumbled back, overwhelmed. Their tools felt useless, their authority meaningless, facing a force that was more than mere plants. Neighbors, emboldened, stepped forward. They formed a human barrier around the garden, holding hands, lanterns glowing, faces determined. The HOA president shouted one last time, but the garden answered first, a brilliant wave of light cascading over the front yard, illuminating the night. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. She realized that this garden, alive with memory and love, could not be defeated. HOA members retreated fully this time, stumbling back to the street, realizing that some forces, love, memory, unity, could not be legislated away. Neighbors cheered softly, embracing each other. Children danced among glowing petals, laughter mixing with the gentle hum of magic in the air. Margaret stepped into the center of her garden, tears of relief streaming down her face. The flowers glowed brighter than ever, a testament to resilience, love, and memory. The night air was calm, yet charged with the glow of the garden. Margaret walked slowly among the petals, feeling a deep sense of peace. Neighbors lingered nearby, sharing quiet smiles. The streets once tense with fear now shimmered with light and unity. Children played among the glowing flowers, laughter echoing. The garden had become a symbol, a reminder of resilience and love. Margaret knelt, touching a single radiant flower. This was all for him, she whispered, thinking of her late husband. The HOA, now defeated, remained at the street's edge, silent. The rules they wielded held no power here, the garden's light had rewritten the night. Neighbors approached Margaret, offering gentle words, congratulations, and quiet reverence. This garden was now their shared triumph. Margaret felt their support like a wave washing over her. She realized she had not stood alone, the community had rallied around love and memory. The garden seemed to respond, petals shimmering brighter as if acknowledging every hand that touched it, every heart that stood beside it. Children placed small stones and drawings among the flowers, little offerings of love, making the garden feel alive with shared memories. Neighbors whispered to each other, sharing stories of courage, of standing up to injustice, of supporting one another through fear. Margaret stood tall, surrounded by this circle of light and love. She felt a deep gratitude, for her husband, her neighbors, and the resilience that bloomed stronger than ever. The HOA, now silent and powerless, watched from a distance. The glow of the garden was a quiet reminder, rules cannot extinguish love or memory. Margaret knelt in the center, touching the soil. The garden pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat, alive with love, life, and memory. Neighbors quietly joined her, hands brushing petals, sharing the magic, making the garden a symbol of their collective courage and heart. Margaret looked up at the night sky, tears of joy on her cheeks. The garden glowed brighter than ever, a living testament to love, memory, and unwavering courage. Morning broke, yet the garden still glowed faintly, petals shimmering as if carrying the memory of the night before. Neighbors walked through the garden carefully, leaving small gifts, notes, and tokens of gratitude. Every gesture added to its quiet magic. Margaret watched, feeling the warmth of community around her. The garden was no longer hers alone, it belonged to everyone who believed in courage. The HOA, silent and humiliated, disappeared from the neighborhood. No rules, no authority could diminish what had been shared here. Children played among the flowers, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of magic still lingering in the air. Margaret knelt in the soil, touching petals as if thanking each one for protecting her home and heart. Neighbors joined her quietly, hands brushing petals, sharing a moment of connection and gratitude. The once feared garden had transformed into a sanctuary, a living symbol of love, memory, and resilience. Margaret smiled, feeling her husband's memory in every bloom, every glow, every whisper of wine through the petals. Neighbors lingered, some leaving small tokens, some simply gazing. The garden had become a place of reflection, hope, and unity. The HOA was never heard from again. Their threats dissolved into silence, leaving only laughter, light, and a thriving community. Margaret walked slowly through the petals, breathing in the calm. Each bloom told a story, of loss, of courage, of love enduring beyond rules. Children laughed and danced, neighbors smiled, and Margaret finally felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. The garden glowed, not just with light, but with the enduring power of memory, courage, and the love of a community that refused to back down. Margaret stood at the heart of the garden, tears of joy on her cheeks. The flowers glimmered brighter than ever, a living testament to love, memory, and unwavering courage.